in the broadest terms, where I used to consider myself a PR agency, now I consider myself a communications agency, and those are not the same. And it's actually makes it, in a way, so much more interesting, right? There's a whole process of educating some of my clients about sort of how to really go about talking about the work. And something that I say all the time to people is, if you can't talk about your work in a way that's compelling, you can't necessarily expect anyone else to. Like, a journalist isn't necessarily going to take the time to kind of delve in, sort of parse out what the stories are and then communicate them in a compelling way. Like, you have to lead that, and that is a lot of fun.
Can you tell us a little bit about your schooling and like what your first introduction to this field was?
So I really wanted to be an architect since I was a little girl. I come from a pretty creative family. My uncle's an architect. My grandparents were in the design business. They owned a very high-end furniture upholstery company in New York City. And I just grew up with people who appreciated art. My mother used to take me to museums all the time, and architecture was just sort of a very early love for me, and I don't really remember why. Design generally, like, I think I asked for like a subscription to Vogue when I was like 8, right? Like, I was like so into all of that, and I grew up in like not a cool place at all. Summit, New Jersey, like way not cool. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty, but like, even in the 70s, it was like people, do you guys know what a Bermuda bag is? Do you guys know what that is? Like, the Preppy Handbook was sort of like the ruling style guide, the Bible, right, for people in my town. And I was like, I'm out of here. So I wanted to be an architect. I went to Columbia as an undergraduate. I was an architecture major, and I couldn't draw, right? So I couldn't draw well enough to express my ideas. And so after 3 years of architecture major, I was like pulling my hair out and feeling like I wasn't doing the right thing. I went to Rome for my junior year and found that I just like loved writing about the buildings and sort of looking at them. And so I ended up in my senior year changing my major to architectural history. I spent a year, I did a fellowship program for a year in Israel after college, and then I went to the Architectural Association to get a master's in architectural history and theory, which now as a parent I find so funny, because never once did my mother or father say to me, like, what the heck are you going to do with that degree, right? They were just so encouraging. They were like, if that's what you love, go do it, right? And I truly had no idea what I was going to do with it at the end. I thought maybe I would get a job editing books on architecture, working for Princeton Architectural Press or Rizzoli. I sort of stalked Kevin Lippard, like on the down low, stalked Kevin Lippard, who was the founder of Princeton Architectural Press, for about 3 months when I finished graduate school. And he wasn't hiring, so I was like, now what, right? So I ended up taking a job in a PR agency. And when I tell you that I went into that job on the first day not knowing that what PR was or that it was a thing, I just was so desperate to start supporting myself and to not be living, to be living in the city with my friends. And I took this job, and I can't say that I loved it, but I learned so much from my boss because it was a small agency. You guys are all too young to remember this, but you used to get a job in the New York Times. There used to be a help wanted section. And you would go through and you would look in your field, like public relations is all under P, right? And you'd go there, and then there was architecture. I would go in there and I would look. Once I decided that I didn't want to be working for this woman anymore, I was looking every Sunday, and there was a job for a director of public relations at an architecture firm. And I was like, oh my God, that's a thing, right? And I became the director of public relations at age 25 at Hardy Holzman Pfeiffer Associates, which no longer exists, but was the most amazing education. I worked for Hugh Hardy and Malcolm Holzman in the New York office for 4 years. And this was a time when they were, 42nd Street was being redeveloped. It was still old pornographic theaters, right? At XXX theaters, they had the Jenny Holzer truisms on all the marquees around the theaters, because they were trying to like make it less scary than it was what it actually was. I worked on the Rainbow Room. I worked on Windows on the World at the World Trade Center, right? The New Amsterdam Theater, the New Victory Theater, Bryant Park, the Brooklyn Academy of Music. I mean, the list of New York projects that I got to work on with him was so extraordinary. And it was like, and he was such a personality, and he just, I kind of learned everything from him. And then I became an editor at Record after 4 years of working there. And then I had my son and took 3 months off, and then came and worked at SOM. And that was when I started working here.
So being 25 years old and starting at such an amazing position.
I mean, it was kind of BS. Sorry. It was BS in the sense that, yes, I had responsibility for public relations, but I was also the only PR person. So it wasn't like I had a huge staff. I'm the director. You're the helpers, right? Like, I did everything from soup to nuts. I did all the award submissions. I did all the writing. I did all the everything. And that is probably better, right? Because from an educational standpoint, like, again, I just learned so much about how to do this. And I also, I would say that at the time, there really weren't many firms that had PR people. Hugh was very committed to the idea that if you sort of left PR to be done by your marketing team, it would never get done, because the needs of marketing and the kind of constant deadlines of marketing are such that PR would always end up being overlooked. So he was really one of the first to hire an in-house PR person. That was like a very long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah.
I think I hit everything.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Well, I have one more question on that. Did you ever have imposter syndrome?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. I think I probably still do some days, right? There's just, there are just times like I've done this for so long, but there's always some new challenge, right? Or some issue that I haven't had to address before. I would say particularly when I'm in crisis mode, I'm sort of like, am I the right person to deal with this? Like if I'm, I would say, I was telling Dina earlier that, here we are at the World Trade Center. Like I worked on this building. I worked on One World Trade Center. I worked on the memorial. And, I was in the room with several governors, right? I was in the room, like I was up, like climbing on the steel structure. And by the way, I don't really love heights, right? So climbing on the structure, showing journalists around and talking about the architecture of these buildings. Now, I always prefer to have one of the actual architects, professionals talking about the building, but every once in a while I have to be able to as well. And every time I do that, I'm just like, what am I doing, right? Like, or am I the right person to be doing this? And, that just makes me prepare so much more than... So in a way, I think women are struck by imposter syndrome, I think, at a far greater rate than men are, right? We know that, right? That's a fact. But for me, it's also very motivating to feel like I always want to try to avoid feeling that way. And so it makes me prepare a lot.
And so is that also how you approach challenges, or do you have like a different method on when something challenging comes up? How do you, approach it?
What I would say is that, again, like I've been doing this for a long time. I tell everyone who I work with, like public relations is not rocket science, right? There's no, you don't need an advanced degree to do this. There's a low bar to entry, right? Anyone can call them a publicist. And it's part of why I think the profession doesn't have a great reputation, because there are a lot of people doing it who don't really care about it. I mean, the good news for me is that I care so much about architecture and design that I think that comes through in everything I do. And I do try to let that sort of sense of heart and caring lead when I'm faced with a challenge. And to say, like, I don't want to fail at this. I don't want to let the client down. This is a really important story. I really want to make sure it gets told. How am I going to do that? Or whatever the issue is. And, again, it has, the profession has changed a lot. There are things that used to feel easier that now feel hard or harder. And without sounding too kind of woo-woo about it, like I do try to breathe through that stuff. I think it helps, right? To just like kind of sit with myself, sit with the issue, and to try to find a way through it. Like, there's that, very famous quote about kind of the obstacle being the path, right? Like I do believe that. Like you're not going to be able to go around it. Like you have to go through it. That's sort of what I do. I mean, what choice do we have, right?
Yeah. You spent some time, you said, at Architectural Record, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a very different side of the business than working for a client.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you approach those two very different parts of this career?
I got to a point at HHPA where I felt like I just didn't, I guess I felt a little burned out, honestly. I just felt like I didn't want to be doing PR anymore. And I sort of was like, I don't want to do this. And I had been I worked so closely with people at Record, and we had such a nice relationship. And there was one editor in particular whose name at the time, his name is Charles Lynn. And I think we went to lunch or something, and I guess I opened up to him and said that I was sort of feeling a little tired of PR, and I really felt like I wanted to be doing more writing. And he kind of went to bat for me. Like we had worked really well together. He went to Bob Ivy at the time. I ended up getting a job. I was so over the moon. And I also really loved that job. I have to say, like, it was a very exciting moment for me in the sense that, like, I had never experienced that kind of community in a way because, at SOM, this is before I worked in SOM, but HHP, I was the only PR person. And even though I had support and Hugh always taught me everything, like, I didn't have, like, a group of people that were all working on the same thing together. And at Record, I just found this so thrilling at the time. Like every morning, or at least 3 mornings a week, we would all sit around a table and just talk about ideas. And like that is so powerful, right? As a motivator, just to feel like you're being heard, your ideas are being considered. And I loved it. The truth is, though, like I made no money, right? And I was married, I got pregnant, I had a baby. And suddenly I was like, oh my God, like it's going to cost me more to pay a babysitter than it is that making, right? And that was like a pretty brutal, like a rough awakening, I would say. And I ended up asking if I could go free. I also wasn't totally ready it was my first child. I wasn't ready to leave him when he was 3 months old and go back into the office. So it was all of those things that I think women struggle with, honestly, like that sense of sort of, can I do this all? Do I want to do this all? In retrospect, like, if I had said to them, I want to take 3 more months just unpaid and assess after that, I probably could have done that and gone back to Record. And I did really love the job. But it all worked out, right? It all worked out. And I do think, for me, that moment of that tension, right, of having a young child, not wanting to leave, but also not wanting, like I was watching daytime television one day when he was 6 months old, like, I was breastfeeding, whatever, and I had the TV on and I was like, my brain is going to start seeping out my ears if I don't go back to work. So like, that's what I just like, was like, oh my God, I can't do this anymore. And that's when I went back to SOM, and they had called me before and said that they would like me to work for them, and I finally was like, I'm ready. That is a pretty universal struggle for a lot of women. I think I'm incredibly privileged to have been able to make some choices in that, and I know not everyone can. I think it's important for people who have been through it, like me, to talk about it, because I think especially to a realm of women who are probably a lot younger than I am, right, who may be going through it or going to go through it at some point, like it is a struggle, right? It is like full stop a struggle. I think these workplaces have become much more attuned to that in the last 20 years than they were when I had my children. And that's the good news, but it's still, it's still an issue.
How did you balance motherhood and having your own company at that point?
I don't really know exactly, but I did, right? I just kind of figured it out day in, day out. I have a husband who's a partner, right? So I think that really helps. I obviously had babysitting help at different times, not full time initially, which is crazy to think about. Yeah. But in the beginning, like the business also ramped up in a way, right, that allowed me some freedom, right, and or allowed me some flexibility, right? Because I could sort of, in the beginning, I think I was probably working like 5 or 6 hours a day, right? And then when it got fully going, now I don't even know how many hours a day I work. Like I work every day of the week, right? In a way that I love, like I don't resent it at all. But it's, my kids are older. 2 of them are out of the house. And I can do that, right? And I appreciate that. I would say that probably the hardest time for me as a mother and a business owner was when my 3rd child was born in March of 2009. So it was like the middle of the Great Recession. And I was, excuse my French, I was working my ass off, right? To make sure that like I kept my clients, right? It was really felt so important. Like it was such a scary time. And I was just working so hard to kind of keep everyone happy. And this baby came along and I was like, I can't take any time off, right? And so I remember like weeping at my desk, probably postpartum, right? With the baby in the car seat next to me on the floor. My kids are amazing. So that's the good news. Whatever, I feel like I must have done something right? Because they came out really well. And I actually do think it's really good for kids to see their mothers working personally. Like, that's my perspective on this. It's not a prescription for anyone, but I do think, like, I could never be a helicopter mom because I didn't have time. And I think that's good, right? Like, I think that's probably a good outcome. But there's definitely no magic, right? It was just like day in, day out, grind, get home, and do it again, right? And now now I'm at a point where I have so much more freedom, and it's so nice.
Yeah, I think a lot of women struggle with starting their own business, or does it seems really scary to move away from that stability, right? Especially getting your own clients and you're building that client base. How did you approach that problem and building your client base?
It all happened really, really organically. And I think that is something else that I consider myself so lucky about, right? Like that the way it happened and the way the business ramped up, starting from 20 years ago when sort of starting slowly and building, it all just happened through word of mouth. I've never really done any marketing for myself. I just am finally getting my website up. It's like a total Dr. Heal Thyself moment, because like I yell at my clients all the time about their websites, right? I gotta fix it, we gotta fix it. And then like mine has been in like construction for 2 years, and I'm just like, I'll get to it when I get to it. But I try to do social, I try to do interviews every once in a while, but like, I have not, it's just all been so organic. And I think when I started, there just weren't that many people who did what I did in architecture and design. Like now it's there's a lot more. And so it's a different sense of competition, but I also just feel like there's enough business to go around, right? And I don't feel like I go after something and then like, oh, that person stole it from me. Like, you win some, you lose some, right? And like I have enough business and I'm fine, right? Thank God. What I will say about PR is that, it is essentially sales, right? Like I have to go and convince people to care about something that my clients are doing. And from that standpoint, it has been incredibly important to me over the years that I have clients that I actually like and that I can get behind and who I think have good stories and who are doing work that is meaningful, right? And not like destroying the planet, right? That these are people who I think are earnest actors. They're trying to do things in the best interest of a larger society, environment, etc. And that is important to me. And I think part of why I have been committed to keeping my business very small is that, because I don't want to feel like I have so many mouths to feed that I have to take whatever comes along. So that also kind of addresses the competition, kind of the marketing question, getting clients. It's just, if something comes in and I don't want it, and I say no to that, like I completely recognize what a luxury that is, but it's also somewhat intention as well.
What's your day-to-day like right now?
Pretty different. I usually try to date at 10. It works for me. I go to the gym every day, and like that's the first thing I do every morning. I go 7 days a week. I have one child at home that's in 8th grade. We get her out the door, and then I kind of start working. And very often I'll start working before. If I get up early, I'll start working early. Just like check email, see what's coming overnight. From there, it's a little bit of a blur of Zoom calls. I think we all feel that way. And even now I feel like this is the weirdest moment, because it's like I'm sort of 25% in person, 75% on Zoom, and I really haven't figured out how to balance those things. Like if I have to be in person at 10:30 on a Zoom at 11:30, like where do I do the Zoom, right? Like how does that work? So figuring all of that out, but it's Zoom calls pretty much and meetings, but with time reserved to actually like do the work, respond to emails in between as much as possible. I actually am kind of an introvert in the sense that like I really do need time during the day to myself, just focus time for writing, for editing, for checking emails. I can't go from one thing to the next. It's really, really exhausting for me. Every client call that I have, there's some action item, right? So just keeping track of what those actions are. And if I don't do that immediately, it all sort of tends to get a little bit lost. It's a lot of that. And then there's there are events periodically. Obviously those paused during the pandemic. Usually at least once or twice a month I have an event. Try to have like a lunch meeting with a journalist or someone that I just sort of want to meet at least once or twice a month. So it's a nice mix, I think, but I just spend a lot of time at my desk, right? I just spend a lot of time staring at a screen. I'd like to do less of that. But I think we all suffer from it.
Yeah, I know. My signature question is, what is your one piece of advice to people who are considering this as a career path?
So I think it's something that I said a little bit earlier, maybe in a different form, is to try to lead with your heart, right? And to try to lead with passion, right? And to let that take you where you want to go. We spend way too much of our lives at work for work to be something that we have to do or don't enjoy. I do also know that as I'm saying this, it sounds a lot easier than it is, right? And it's, it takes time, I think, to find that place. I would say something that no one ever said to me as a young girl, and I sort of wish someone had said to me is, you're going to be working most of your life, right? In some form, right? That is the bulk of your life is going to be spent in whatever your profession or job is. You should like it, right? And maybe you don't love it every day, but you should at least like it. And you should at least feel like you're making a difference, and you should at least feel like you're meeting interesting people and like you're contributing in some way. And, I will say that I have gone through periods where I've struggled with this a bit because I'm like, oh, PR is so dumb, right? Like sort of relating to what I was saying before about PR people not having a good reputation and whatever. But, what I have realized is that you can be a different kind of whatever you are, right? Yeah. And if you lead with your heart and you use your head and you share what you know with people and you try to help them be better, right, then everything you're doing is totally worth it. And I think that is important.
Do you feel like it's harder to promoting something new to the market, or is harder to solve the reputation risk of a firm? For example, like SciR has some reputation problem because of the unpaid internship. Do you think it's harder to deal with that kind of situation, or is it harder to introduce a new building, a new project to the public, but make everybody amazed about it?
Yeah. I think both of those specific examples have their challenges. Like the SciArc thing, SciArc has had some serious reputational damage recently that is going to take some time and a lot of discipline for them to fix. If I were advising them, I would say to them, we have to be looking at every single thing that you're saying about yourself and how you're saying it and what some specific steps to sort of repair that. So that's a serious challenge. And I actually had a similar challenge in my career working with the National Academy of Design before Greg Westner, who's a very dear friend, became the director. This is now going back probably 10 years. The National Academy sold artwork to cover operational expenses. That is against the rules of the American Association of Museums, and they weren't excommunicated, but it was something like that dramatic sounding, right? They wanted to work with us to sort of try to help repair the damage, but then they didn't listen to anything we said, so we ended up not stopping working with them because there was no point. The act of introducing something new is also hard in a way, right? It shouldn't be so hard. But more and more, the press are looking for clickbait. They're looking for stories on things that everyone seems to care about or know, big names. I would say both of those things come with their challenges, but they're both really interesting.
But which one you like?
What do I like better? Probably introducing something new. I mean, my bias personally is that I do like happy stories, right? I like the SciArc thing is like a little bit of an unhappy situation, and it's fixable, but it's hard, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of infighting going on about this because just knowing the players and stuff. So I think I would prefer the nice, happy, here we have this new thing, let's get as much press as we can, put ourselves out in the book. So that would be my choice.
How do you deal with a client that will either reject or not want to work with you, or a client that says no? That's the best way to deal with rejection.
Oh, I mean, the only way to deal with it is just to say, I wish you good luck, right? Because you never know when someone's going to come back. I mean, the one thing that I have to say that I do not like, and this happened to me recently, and it truly, again, I feel so lucky. This doesn't happen to me very often. But a client said that they didn't have the money to hire a PR agency, and then I saw that they were working with another agency, right? So don't lie to me. I'm a big girl. I can take it, right? I have a great business. I would love to work with you if it works out. If it doesn't, that's also fine. But just say we're going in a different direction, or we decided to work with another agency, and I would say, God bless, good luck, right? But, you know, he lied to me, and the next time I see him, I'm going to say, like, you didn't need to lie to me, right? Like, again, like, that's just silly, right? We're totally going to see each other, right? Like, I know him, he knows me, and, like, you don't know what someone's reasons are for making a decision that they make. It may not have been up to them. So don't burn bridges. I think that's a good rule of thumb with everything, even if you're upset. So many of us are now working from home part of the time. I made it a priority from the get-go, so going back 20 years before this was sort of a thing, to say, I am going to work from home Mondays to Fridays, always, right? So at least I could be around for my kids. I could drive the carpool, right? I could, you know, if I needed to be like the lunch mom, I could take an hour off to do that, right? I made that decision and I made it work, and I could do that again because that was the agency that I had, and that was important to me. I am in a service business, right? I don't have total control over my life, my schedule. You know, a client has an issue, I need to be prepared to pick up the phone and talk to them about it no matter what time it is. Like, that is also true. But, you know, there are these things that I was able to do just from a structural standpoint that made an enormous difference to me as a young mother, right? That just made me feel like I was in touch with, you know, my household, my husband, my kids, and that for me was kind of a game changer, honestly. And then I would be in the city, you know, maybe 3 days a week. It's to some extent had some control over what hours I was in the city, right? That was important, right? And I think now that for more people, it's more acceptable and it's kind of understood that, you know, working from home is actually working, right? Because for a long time, people like thought I was not, right? And I was, right? And that really, it always bothered me because I felt like, you know, again, I sort of felt like if it were a man saying it, they wouldn't question it. Right? I was working, and it showed, right? It showed in the results that I was getting. It showed in the work I was doing. So I just made it happen. Again, like having a good husband, right? It does help.
What's your favorite thing about the job in their company?
I think it's you know, on any given day, I could be working on 8 or 9 or 10 different things. So it's never boring. I also just have this, like, these moments of, like, kind of intense gratitude when I meet really interesting people that I've admired for a long time from afar, and then they like call me and I'm in their office. I think it's the nature of the work I do, but I think it's also true on a lot of other jobs that you know, you get to just meet whole people, right? And I think that is so much fun. And I also do really try to make an effort for the people that I have either met briefly or want to meet to get to know them, because I like that as well.
When you're working, are there certain moments of, like, let's say, freedom or power that you are aware that you have that perhaps your clients or architects don't have? For example, are there positions that you felt comfortable taking in the past that you know that for, you know, material purposes or whatever, your clients have not been able to take that position?
I would say that I think it's harder in a very large firm like SOM. The firm says no to a lot of work, but I think that once they're working with a client, it's harder to then kind of break off, you know, the relationship if something's not going well. Again, for me, like having a small business, like that's been a huge priority. So that's something that I'm very aware of. And in fact, Michelle works for a firm called Space Smith that's owned by a really cool woman named Jane Smith. She just did an interview with Diana for the magazine, and one of the things she says was, I didn't want to be a cog in the wheel. I wanted to build my own wheel, right? And I just was like, oh my God, yes, right? Like that is amazing. Again, we're all in service businesses, right? I don't even feel like it's bad behavior, right? I just think like every client has good days and bad days, tough things, good things, right? We all have to deal with that with them. And there are always ups and downs, but there's just a kind of a generalized sense that I have as a really small business owner, and I think this is also true of people I know who run smaller firms, that if they need to kind of exit a relationship, they can. And that to me is like just knowing that in some ways, I think it makes me a little more fearless, I would say. And I think that it's really nice to be able to work without fear. And I do remember, right, being in-house, even at HHK, like these are jobs that I loved, being in-house here, right, being a record, right. You know, I used to have those Sunday night jitters, right. I don't know if, I haven't had that in so many years. I don't know if you guys have that. And it was sort of like, oh my God, what is this week going to bring? I don't know. Am I going to be good enough? Am I this, right? Like, you know, there's just like this fear, right, that would creep in. And, you know, being able to kind of do away with that, like that is joy, right, for me. Like it's huge.
I just want to know, how do you prepare yourself to the client while you're working on architecture program that you're not architect. How do you convince them, like, and you didn't work through this project, but how do you convince your client to buy this idea or this program?
It's a great question, and I'm gonna say that like there was a period of time where if you asked me anything about this building or One World Trade Center, I'm not gonna say I knew as much as the architects because they have a level of technical knowledge that I of course didn't have, but I could speak as well about these projects as anyone in the firm, right? And part of that was just like I was so immersed in them. And I also do come from an architectural background, which I think makes a difference. I care about architecture, right? That's why I do this job, not because I'm like, I went to school, I studied PR, and I ended up, that would never work, right? And there's a certain amount of credibility that I bring just because I did study architecture as an undergraduate. I did get a master's degree in something. I can write about architecture. I've done a master's thesis, like I've done all of that. But the more interesting answer to the question, I think, is that the role of the PR person is to translate, right? The way the architects talk about their buildings, and some architects are amazing at this and some are less amazing at it, right? And I'm sure we know that, right? We know who the really good people are, and the ones who are amazing at it are the ones who are able to make it interesting to people who aren't architects. And that is my job, right? That is in a nutshell what I do. It's about saying like, what are the stories that are going to be interesting to a broader audience, and how can I tell those stories? So it isn't really about knowing like the tolerance of the steel beams. It's much more about sort of a generalized sense of like, how is this building affecting the environment? How is it contributing to issues of social equity? How is it, what is it doing on an urban scale? What is it going to be like when you walk by it? What is it going to be like to work in it? For me, that is probably the most important thing about the work I do, right? As a person who knows, like the attitude that I bring to work every day is that architecture and design affect 100% of the people 100% of the time, right? Like that is what I know in my soul. As a culture, particularly in America, we do not care about architecture and design. We don't prioritize it and we don't understand it. So my job is to make it matter to people who may not understand that it matters. And that is magic, right? When I can do that, it's magic. That's where, to me, the rubber hits the road, right? And it gets really interesting.
How do you think that studying architectural design of history and theory has contributed to your like philosophy of professional practice?
It's maybe more of a symptom than anything, right? I think the fact that I study those things is just the information in there is that I cared about it enough my whole life, right, to like go to college for it, to get a master's degree in it, not knowing what I was going to do with it. I wrote my master's thesis on Eric Mendelsohn. Like I have never mentioned Eric Mendelsohn in my professional life ever once, right, except to say like I wrote my master's thesis on him, right? So there is no direct correlation in some ways, except that it's an indicator of where my true interest lies. And that is like, again, like it's sort of the lucky piece for me is that I was able to figure out a way to deputize that educational background and make it work for me in my professional life.
Are you able to pick client or to pick what you want to work with, or what type of project you like to deal with the most?
I think I do that. I mean, look, I'm responding to what's incoming, right? Like, it is a bit ironic, and I recognize that. I am marketing people for a living, and I don't market myself, right? So my husband is constantly telling me, you should make a list of the people you want to be working for and figure out how to get to them. And I'm like, nope. I'm not going to do that. I'll tell you this is sort of a funny thing, and this is many years ago. I guess when it must have been in 2008 when Obama chose Michael Smith. The Obama chose Michael Smith to design the White House, and a journalist called and said, Liz, you have to work for Michael Smith. Like, they have terrible PR. You have to write to Michael Smith, and you need to tell him that he needs to hire you. And I was like, all right. So I sent Michael Smith a letter, right? And of course he never responded because it's ridiculous, right? It's a completely ridiculous notion that I would have written to Michael Smith. I respond to what is inbound very often. And there are times when someone contacts me where I feel like maybe it's not the right fit for me for whatever reason. I have to be really careful about conflicts of interest, right? So I work for SOM. I can't work for Gensler or HOK or KPF, right? Like where, there's like a list of firms that are kind of off the table. Like I wouldn't work for a firm. This has never happened that someone's called me, but work for a firm that designed prisons or, you know what I mean? Pick your poison. Like I'm going to say no to that. But otherwise, like I feel like almost everyone has a really interesting story. And part of what I love about my job is getting to know what people's stories are and why they do what they do, what makes them tick, what makes them interesting, and helping them to communicate that. Because that's the sweet spot. Like everyone in this room has a story to tell, right? In some way, shape, or form. You all work for someone that has a story to tell. And it's a story, the word unique is completely overused, but it is a unique story, right? This is something that no one else can say, right? About, how you were raised, where you were raised, how that dovetails with your education, how that dovetails with your interests, what that means, why you get out of bed every morning to do the job that you do. Helping people to sort of get in touch with that and talk about it is kind of fascinating to me.
How do you approach creating a unique narrative for different architects, different projects? How do you extract that unique narrative, the story from your projects?
Sometimes you sort of know it instinctively, right? And sometimes I'll say to someone, like, I feel like this is the story. And then I'll like blurt it out. And then there are other times where it's a little, it can be a process. It can be sometimes a slightly painful process, right? Like not unlike pulling teeth, right? Because it's not everyone's instinct to talk about themselves or their work in that way. But I always come back to this, right? If you can't do it, if we can't figure out a way to do it, no one else is going to for us, right? So like, let's start there. And so, sometimes it comes through a series of conversations, right? If it's a project, it really helps if I could see the project in person. And then talk to as many people as I can who are working on the project team to kind of get their perspectives on it as well. Though I'm going to say, like, sometimes it's very simple and very obvious, and other times it is not. But you can always get there. You can almost always get there, right? I mean, most people, if they're hiring a PR agent, are doing so to then be completely reticent with that PR agent. You can usually pull it out of that. And I'm making it sound violent. It's not violent, right?
How many people you work with and how many clients?
I don't know. Through the pandemic, I had 2 people. I've never been bigger than 4, and like 4 to 5 is kind of like it's like as big as I would want to be. Right now I have Dina, partially like kind of ramping up. She just started. It's great. And I have another woman who's a writer, and I have a third person who I'm interviewing now. I will say that like the hardest part of the job in some ways is hiring, because like you sort of need someone who's a Swiss Army knife, right? Someone who's good at technology, someone who's good at writing, someone who understands architecture, cares about design, right? Like it's hard to find those people. And there are times when I've done this by myself, right? And so at any given time, I have between like 8 and 14 clients, something like that. And that's sort of that's a big range, but that's about the right amount. I actually really love working with small firms. I love working with small firms. Just as a rule of thumb for myself, is they need to have enough work to be able to like justify having someone working for them on a ongoing basis. I mean, sometimes people hire me just to focus on one project, right? And then it will either go on from there or not. I love small firms. Like I feel like it's like a 12 to 20 person, like that range is always super interesting. I always tell people that like, if you're a small firm and you want to grow, like don't grow past 40. Because that like somehow that is some kind of a benchmark in terms of how the firm changes.
A big part about growing a business is growing your own personal network.
Yeah.
So especially in the beginning, I want to hear about how you went on to find these clients, like really worked for us, and how networking really helped you in your business.
When I was thinking about having my own business, I thought like maybe it was the right move. I remember I said to a bunch of journalists that I worked with, like, I'm thinking about this. If you know of it, I want to try my hand at it. If you know of anyone, let me know. A journalist that I used to work with all the time set me up with an architect in San Francisco who, named after Yaron, who was doing such interesting work. Like, she's amazing. She's actually doing all the Planned Parenthood clinics in the Bay Area. Like, right away, I was like, oh my God, yes, like this is fascinating. And it was after September 11th. And so there was suddenly this like very heightened question around security, right, for everyone, but particularly for these planned parenthood clinics. The recognition that I could do it, right? That I could do it long distance, that I knew how to do like the billing and the, right, just like the basic kind of business functions, and help her tell a story was so gratifying. Here's what is an example of, if you want something, tell the universe, tell the people you know, mention it at cocktail parties, mention it, I mean, in a way that's appropriate, right? Like I wouldn't like be on the phone at work being like, I got to get out of here, help me, right? Like I think, but like let your network know, and everybody has a network, right? Whether you think you do or not, you definitely have one. Make a list, right? Keep a database of your people, right? Like, start to make sure that you have that network formalized somewhere so that you can, if you're one day feeling like, oh my God, I need to, like, who am I going to call? What am I going to do? Like, you have a list that you can look at. It's very, very reassuring. Tell them, right? And put it out there into the world. And this is something that I tell my clients all the time. Like, if you want to take on a new typology, or if you want to grow in this way, like, start to talk about that as if, of course you can do it, right? And then you don't know who's listening, right? And who's going to give you that opportunity.
What will be the biggest obstacle when it comes to talking to clients for the first time, or some good icebreakers to get the conversation?
They usually have a reason that they're calling, so it's not like I need to break the ice so much, right? The harder thing is sometimes when I'm calling a journalist or something kind of maybe cold or out of the blue, and then I have to like make them like me, right? The client wants me to want to work with them usually, or at least to consider working with them. That isn't so much the issue. I think the harder thing at times is when we actually formalize a relationship and start to kick off, it's getting them to give me all the information that I need and to understand that I'm not internal. If they don't communicate something to me, that I may not know it, right? Like, yes, I can dig around on your website. I can look at press that just appeared. I can do all of that. But there's an ongoing, prolonged, relationship long, kind of conversation that has to go on about what they're doing, what they're thinking about, what they're working on, so that I can respond in kind.